Hi, everybody. We'll give you a second to join up. I know a lot of folks are finding that you have to update Zoom today, but we're really excited to have you. I'm Steve Barnes from George Mason University, and I wanted to welcome you to today's session of the World Reconfigured: Consequences of Russia's War in Ukraine. I wanted to make just a couple of quick program notes here at the beginning. We're going to meet next week at our usual 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to have a conversation with Cynthia and I and talk about, all of the guests that we've had and some of the lessons that we take from all of that. We're then, unfortunately, because of my travel schedule, we're going to have to take a week off on the 31st of March. But we're really excited, and I'll kind of just tease this because I literally got an email about 20 minutes ago. But we think we're going to have retired General Mark Hertling join us on April 7th as a guest. So I think it'll be interesting and different to have somebody with that kind of background join us. But anyway, welcome. Glad to have everybody here today. And Cynthia, over to you.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I'm Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our esteemed guest. We are incredibly lucky to be talking to Rana Mitter, who's a professor of history and politics of modern China at Oxford, where he has long directed the China Center. Rana is going to be moving across the Atlantic Ocean starting in September to take a post at Harvard. His last two books have focused on World War II in China, with a 2013 book titled in the U.S., Forgotten Ally, China's War with Japan, 1937 to 45. And then in 2020, he followed it up with a second book talking about China's Good War, how World War II is shaping a new nationalism in China today. So as you can see, he's interested not just in the social history of World War II, but also in the impact of the war on Chinese politics today. So Rana came of age sort of when Steve and I did, in this sort of 1989 to 1991 turn. And I think that as a result, he's been very much fascinated with questions of continuity and change in the evolution of these big countries, China for him, and obviously the former Soviet Union for Steve and myself, over time, right? And how one generates transformation, both of political systems and of values, right? So I look forward to a really wide-ranging discussion, both touching on the Chinese-Russia relationship and the Russia-Ukraine war, but also moving beyond that. But we're very, very grateful to have him with us. He's really one of the world's top experts on modern China, and it's such an honor. Rana.
Cynthia, very good to be here. Thank you so much for those, I think, overly kind words. But thank you and Steve for inviting me on what I know is an extremely esteemed platform and a conversation that has been going on for quite some time with some very, very interesting people involved. What I'll do, if I may, is just give perhaps 7 to 10 minutes of comments on what's been happening in China very recently, and then I think we can relate that to the wider themes that I know that your group likes to take forward in terms of how this relates to questions of authoritarianism and democracy, and more broadly speaking, what it means in terms of some of the issues of stability or otherwise that we're all, I think, concerned about at the moment. So the last few weeks have been actually pretty active ones in some ways in China. If you want to stretch back not very far, but to the far, far off days of, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, when everyone, including me, still thought that the COVID regulations were going to be in China, for years to come. And that turned out to be a dud prediction, to put it mildly. Then in the last few days, let alone weeks, we've seen some quite important, very important developments. Number one, the leadership shift, which has now been confirmed, solidified at the 2 meetings, as they're known in the Chinese context, the Lianghui, the National People's Congress, and the Consultative People's Congress, which both operate at the same time in springtime, usually in March, as indeed has happened this year. And just today, we have woken up or seen our mornings illuminated by the news that Xi Jinping will be visiting Moscow in just a few days' time. And I would be very interested to hear the views of my distinguished hosts and the wider group about how that looks from the Russian side, as well as the Chinese side. Before we get to that, though, let me lay out, if I may, two scenarios, because I think in some ways they summarize two potential pathways for China in the next year to 5 years. At one level, they look almost entirely contradictory, I think, and yet they are both plausible at a non-trivial level. They're not compatible with each other, but I don't see yet that we are absolutely assured that we know which one is going to happen. So having given that description in the abstract of a fork in the road, let me try and put a bit of empirics on the description. So one scenario is one in which the core issue facing today's China, the China of Xi Jinping, the China of Li Qiang, the new prime minister, and of the new leadership that is found in the Politburo Standing Committee, the primary problem in scenario number one that is facing them is the problem of the economy. The problem, in other words, that the social contract, that the model that has operated for maybe 40 years is in some ways now sputtering, running out of road, finding it difficult to fire up again after the COVID period, which was economically speaking very damaging for China. If you look particularly at some of the engines of entrepreneurship, the small, medium enterprises, they were hit very badly because they couldn't predict anything from inventory to customer base to the level to which banks were going to support them. So there's plenty of policies being put forward to try and put support into that sector. But broadly speaking, there's a bigger message. There's a 5% growth rate that's been posited for China this year. That's probably achievable because, of course, things had got so bad under COVID that actually getting up to 5% off the top of that in 1 year is plausible. Otherwise, the Chinese government would not have put the number forward. But whether you can keep going 5% year on year, that is much, much more difficult to see, I have to say. Doesn't mean that China's economy can't grow. There are sources of growth, not least China is, and I think will remain for a long time to come, an extraordinary innovator in technology. It is not it's definitely not Silicon Valley in terms of the absolute kind of originality of first tier technological innovation. But at the very highest level of the second tier, there is no doubt that in Shenzhen, in Haidian, in Hangzhou, the combination of the sheer size of China's market, the largest single internal market anywhere in the world in terms of consumers, combined with the capacity of civil and military sectors to operate across boundaries and cross-fertilize in terms of innovation, and of course the directedness of 2.4% of GDP in private and public operating in service of research and development. These all filter in, and they create areas of immense growth, such as South China, where you will see a per capita GDP of $23,000 a year, innovation in areas like electric vehicle batteries. In other words, that story about green growth, economic expansion, and overseas exports that China wants to tell to the world, and which has, let's be frank, lots of substance to it, and which is being listened to very carefully, not in North America perhaps, but in South America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. So that's a story about China becoming a leaner, greener economy, pushing back against some of the other factors, which in that scenario are still also there. A demographic crisis, much, much worse than people thought even a year ago. It was June of last year, I think, when the National Statistics Authority of China came out with the news that actually the rapid shrinking of the working age population was even worse than people had realized, because the projections a few years ago off the back of the one-child policy ending had been that China would reasonably rapidly get back to 2.0 children per couple. It's nothing like that. It's like 1.1, and it doesn't look like it's going to head up. So the number of working age people is going to be lower. And that means from everything from pensions, where China pays out pensions at a relatively young age, probably going to have to raise it. You saw Mr. Macron is having a lot of problems with that over here in Europe. In France, I don't think it's going to go all that much better in China, even though the repressive mechanisms the Chinese police have are, to be frank, more coercive than they are by a long way in a democracy democracy. So that's not surprising in a sense, but there will be questions about how those pension ages are going to be dealt with. Also in areas like healthcare and so forth, China needs to be growing that economy because it needs to be paying for older people who need pharmaceuticals, they need elder care, they need all of the various institutional and functional systems that surround a population like the one in South Korea or Japan or Germany, wherever you want to name, where the population is rapidly getting older. So they need that economy to keep growing, and there are scenarios in which it's not a dead certainty, but it's perfectly plausible that that might happen. So that is all scenario number one. It's about the economy. There are lots of areas where you could see green shoots, but that there is nonetheless a series of undermining factors that could mean that the trajectory forward is not as smooth as it might seem. But all of that is in strong contrast to scenario number two. And that is a much more problematic scenario in which essentially the tensions between China and much of the wider world, the United States, Europe, Japan, the global north in general, becomes more and more tense in the next few years, next few years, certainly. It's one in which the future of Taiwan becomes much more contentious, the question of whether or not there would in fact be a confrontation. Quite possibly not a military confrontation. I think we need to be also granular and realistic about this. And I think an awful lot of military analysts would say that actually the idea of a D-Day style invasion of Taiwan is not actually that likely in the near future. But the question of pressure, we've seen the use of Air Force equipment, we've seen the use of economic sanctions, actually, Taiwan's imports and exports in some ways becoming more vulnerable. The fact that many Taiwanese companies have investments and factories on the mainland. So there are lots of factors that could be used to pressure Taiwan. If that ended up being the source of a sort of ratchet effect by which the United States and China at the national level found themselves increasingly confrontational over Taiwan, that would not only be bad for the individual actors involved, it would have a huge effect in terms of the global economy, because it could affect everything, as is now famously known, from high quality semiconductor chip supply to the wider issues of shipping lanes and whether or not the Western Pacific is a place that people feel comfortable investing in significant traffic investment in a whole variety of industries which rely on smooth, uninterrupted supply chains. We also, during COVID, what happens when the Asia-Pacific region finds itself with supply chains suddenly no longer operating because of the fear of COVID coming in on ships. There are quite a lot of similarities in the difficulties that also come when it is a more geopolitically confrontational scenario that might make the Asia-Pacific less safe, less navigable, less smooth in terms of commercial operation than at the moment. The problem there with that scenario, from China's point of view, as well as that of the United States, is that a more a more militarily or at least sanctions-driven confrontation in the area would be very damaging to the economies of both parties. It would certainly damage the United States, but it would have a very significant effect on China's economy. So in that sense, the question really comes down to how much is the pursuit of that economic recovery a really important key strategic goal from the point of view of the Chinese government. Now, my sense at the moment, it's just a sense, is that if you talk to people in China at the moment, there is, a general feeling of relief mixed with sadness at the many deaths that have taken place, but a general feeling of relief that the COVID period is over, that it's not coming back, and that things are coming back to normal. My sense is that both at a popular level and also in a governmental level, trying to restore some of the calm, stability, and normality that was, there in the 2010s, but disappeared in the COVID period, is still a work in progress. Everybody hasn't forgotten about what happened beforehand. It's only a few months, and for the rest of us, it's been a little while, but for China, it's only a few months since that whole apparatus was removed. I don't, therefore, at the moment, see an appetite for greater turbulence in that sense, but at the same time, both of the factors I've mentioned, the desire to try and achieve a series of key national goals, including relating to Taiwan, which is talked about often by China, but also to keep things as calm and stable as possible so that global supply chains either remain with China or at least remain stable, and that the domestic economy is able to stimulate consumption, and to push forward to once again being a motor for growth. These are also key goals, and we will be essentially keeping a very close eye on how compatible they are with each other. So Steve and Cynthia, I'll stop there for now, because I'm sure there's lots of things that come from there, and I haven't even mentioned Russia, Ukraine, but I'm sure we'll get onto that in due course.
Thank you so much, Rana. Our tradition is that first Steve and I ask a couple of questions to get things
Sure.
started, and then we open it up to the audience. And I'm actually going to defer my privilege of asking a question and instead ask a question on behalf of a previous guest of ours. Brandon Friedman is a Middle Eastern expert at Tel Aviv University, and he wasn't able to be here at the earlier time, but he did send me a question. He recently published an article talking about China's recent role in mediating an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And he was texting with me, and we were talking about his surprise that, at least in the United States, it wasn't discussed more as an initiative that was in a lot of ways stepping on Russia's toes, kind of, taking on, a role of leadership in a region that was sort of traditionally in Cold War era seen as being much, sort of Russia's sphere of influence. And so, of course, he asks, how real and how deep is the China-Russia partnership? I actually remember going back to World War II, U.S. cartoons of the relationship between Hitler and Stalin in 1939, where it was literally portrayed often as a marriage of convenience, but one where Stalin was the bride and Hitler was the groom. And there was a sort of an implication in these US cartoons that there was an inequality of power between the two leaders, and that Stalin was the weaker one in 1939. And I wonder, is there that kind of attitude maybe inside Chinese social media, that this is a relationship of convenience and that it's Russia that's the weaker partner? But anyway, he asks how real and deep it is. He says, I've heard that there was a lot of tension within the Chinese Communist Party over how the Ukraine invasion surprised and exposed China. And is this announced visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow an effort by China to keep Russia firmly sort of on China's side, but also maybe stop Russia from being too reckless?
I think there is no doubt, Cynthia, that when it comes to the current relationship between China and Russia, China has many more options than Russia does. And I think that by default makes it the dominant partner. We know that Russia is certainly able to sell its fossil fuels, cereals, and other commodities with some ease to China, thereby relieving the pressure of Western sanctions. But in the unlikely event that China were to stop that trade, also India, of course, is one of the other major powers that's taking those fossil fuels, and that's an interesting mixture into the current situation as well. But in the end, it is up to China how much and how far it wants to pursue that particular element of the relationship. Similarly, with the visit to Moscow, I think it is fair to say that Xi Jinping can offer a great deal or offer not very much, and Vladimir Putin will essentially have to take whatever he's offered with a smile, because it's Putin who's backed himself into a corner with the invasion of Ukraine, and Xi, at this point, is still a person, a leader with a tremendous number of options before him. That was sort of my point about the two scenarios at the beginning, because if you go back to scenario number one, the economic one, there are lots of things in it that need to be dealt with that are problematic. But a plausible scenario is supposing China decided it was just going to put its foot down on the gas when it comes to economic growth. It could certainly find plausible ways to get itself to that scenario, becoming a powerful economic global actor, deciding to leave the Taiwan issue for some undefined time into the future. And that would put it in other ways in a very powerful geopolitical position, even more so than at the moment. I don't see what the equivalent is for Russia. Of course, Russia turns out to be quite, in some ways, quite skillfully through Lavrov, making this alternative narrative work with certain global South actors that actually it's all NATO's fault, it's nothing to do with Russia at all. But even so, that doesn't really help the fundamental issues that Russia has, which is it's got a, I suppose technically now it's steady, it was a declining population at one point. It has a highly undiversified economy, and it is now in a situation where it's spent a tremendous amount of its own GDP on fighting a war that may end up, probably in most best case scenarios, the very best from their point of view, frozen into something that could drain an awful lot of resources for some time. It's not as if the Soviet Union hasn't been here before. Afghanistan obviously put them in that position too. Russia is also just a much poorer country than China. China's the second biggest economy in the world. Russia isn't. So I think in all those terms, when you look at the empirics, there's no doubt that it is Xi who has the menu of choices before him. And as I say, intriguingly, so far, I mean, this could all change. Things in China change week by week, day by day these days. He hasn't pushed any of the buttons that he could push. He's got the potential to push lots of them, but so far that hasn't happened. He seems to be keeping a lot of options open.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way to think about it, and I'm curious. I mean, there's so many different directions we could go here, but the New York Times quoted the foreign minister of China today. So Mr. Wang said they were interested in a quote unquote new type of major power relations in talking about the visit to Russia. He said this is completely different from the practice of some countries which cling to a Cold War mentality, gang up, engage in small circle and factional confrontations, and bully all over the place. And I was just wondering sort of, the extent to which you see China's approach to this as, driven, maybe on the one hand by their relations with these other countries in the global South that you, as you say, right, are buying into this narrative that Russia pushes about the war. And the extent to which, they're really kind of keeping an eye on how the U.S. and Western Europe have responded to all of this with an eye toward something like Taiwan or toward other sort of, future moments for them. Anyway, I just found it such an interesting and sort of way that Wang put it. And I'm just curious your responses to that.
Sure. I mean, the phrase new type of great power relationship, I think, was a slight piece of trolling because it was the phrase that used to be used about what China wanted to have with the United States.
Right.
And clearly having a new type of great power relationship with the US is no longer, at least on the frontline agenda in that way. And whereas the US gets the Cold War mentality thrown at it. I think that my previous point about sort of keeping options open stands, because if China wants to go all in with Russia, it could have, for instance, the last couple of times have voted yes rather than abstain in the United Nations General Assembly when it came to the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. It wasn't necessary for Wang Yi, amongst others, to say that China does recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. One element that I have seen less of this week than I expected, but it may turn up more in social media and elsewhere, is that, as you'll all be aware, it's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War being launched. And of course, the very damaging precedent set, regardless of what you think about the justice or otherwise the war, but the precedent of using the bypassing of a United Nations resolution as a means of launching the breach of a recognized sovereign state is something that provided gold dust to a variety of other actors. And I think Russia, Cynthia and Steve, both correct me on this, has more than once, mentioned this sort of precedent as a way of thinking about, well, actually, this is, not something that we've done for the first. When President Biden said, it's the first time it's happened since 1945. That may be true if you're sitting in Eastern Europe. It's not true if you're sitting in many other parts of the world. And the Russians know this perfectly well, not least as they have a very strong presence in the Middle East. China now, with this new deal that it's managed to broker between the Iranians and the Saudis, that was mentioned before, is also getting itself a little bit more into that space. So I think China is having a high old time actually thinking that it can really hold a lot of cards at the same time and not necessarily drop them. One of the reasons, for instance, that I think that it's unlikely that they're going to absolutely go 100% in with Russia, although the language that's being used is pretty close to, 85 to 90%, is the desire to try and keep good relations with the Europeans. Because I think the thinking is the following. Couldn't guarantee all this because some of it is implied, but I think it's there. One is that there is still, I think, some thinking on the part of Chinese strategists that Europe and the European Union are not wholly behind the American position when it comes to a range of areas to do with Eastern Europe and positions beyond. And also, everyone is looking at the question of who will be president of the United States in 2024, and it's a subject of some speculation in China as it is anywhere else. If there were to be a president, we have no idea who it is at this stage, but if there were to be a president who was more inclined towards an isolationist view of the world, that then leads to a Europe that feels that it has to look out for itself more, and possibly a Europe that then has to talk to China more than it would do at the moment. And China wants to be in a position where it could have that conversation, and going 100% in behind Russia now might shut that off with the likes of France or even Germany or other actors in that area. So I think an awful lot of this is a sort of shadow boxing or a form of theater that is actually not even about what's happening right now, but about what might happen in that very crucial period in the middle of the 2020s.
Thanks. So Marcia has a very interesting question in the chat asking about Xi Jinping's first visit to the United States, which was in 1985, when he actually went to Iowa as part of a corn industry delegation. And then his most recent visit in 2013, where he went to California and met with Barack Obama. And she's asking how that has, in your opinion, informed his understanding of the United States. And I guess I'd like to tack on a question to that as well, and sort of think about how is China defining itself vis-a-vis the United States today? Is it like the same? Is it capitalism, but with a different set of values, like cultural values informing it? Is it all about like sort of wanting the same stuff, just wanting to produce more of it and become, is it framed in terms of economic and territorial power, or is it framed in terms of ideas?
I would say that the period which existed, certainly 25, 30 years ago, in which China looked to the United States, or rather China's elites looked to the United States as a sort of mentor and example, has long since passed. And I think actually the moment almost explicitly when it flipped was 2008, the global financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and the other aspects of the financial system. It looks like we're having a mini run of that today, in fact, with Credit Suisse, First Republic, and all of these banks, but we hope not as serious as 2008. And there was this widely reported comment, I think it's just about authentic, from the then Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, who said to Hank Paulson, who was then the Treasury Secretary of the US, Hank, you used to be our teacher, but what do you have to teach us now? And I think that moment gave a new sort of confidence to China that whatever the flaws might be with its own system, the United States was no longer in a position to make that sort of point of contrast. And I think that, to answer the second part of your question, Cynthia, I think that has led to a strong sense that actually in China, ideas do matter. The difficulty is, so in other words, I'm caricaturing here, and please tell me, push back right away afterwards, but maybe the ideas that matter in Russia at the moment from the leadership point of view are a sort of rapidly forming great Russian nationalism, which is based around a very maximalist view of what the Russian Empire is. But apart from that, much of it is to do with finance, with geopolitics, with the sheer brutality of great power relations. In China, I think the great power relations element is certainly there, but I think there is a very explicit and actually in some ways rather intense set of debates about what particular system of thought best describes what China is doing now. And one of the most interesting documents, because it's a sort of work in progress that almost remains unfinished, is the statement issued, a huge great edict issued in November 2021, or the resolution on the party's history, of which there's only ever been three in Chinese history, one in 1945, one in 1981, which was a repudiation of the Cultural Revolution, and this one in 2021, which was basically meant to mark Xi Jinping's growing ascendancy to power. And the text is interesting because it goes into some detail about strands of thinking that are important to how China's elites, political elites, want to think about themselves. It makes it very clear that it regards Marxism as a continuing and powerful source of relevant thinking. Xi Jinping talks about himself as a 21st century Marxist, and I think he's entirely sincere in terms of what he means by that. He's not about class struggle, but he is about the idea that contradiction, antagonism, thesis, antithesis, synthesis are a means, a framework of explaining real life events, US-China confrontation, the difficulty that comes between trying to get rapid economic growth and making sure that it's green. Contrast that perhaps Mao would have called antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. You know, all these are good Hegelian Marxist terms. Mao spent a lot of time thinking about them. Whether Xi Jinping personally does is another matter. I think he, he certainly put his name to them, but there are plenty of theorists who spend a lot of time in China thinking about that. The difference with the era of Mao is that the other strand, which was absolutely forbidden at that time, which has reemerged as a major strand of thinking, is China's pre-modern philosophical tradition. This was taboo in much of the 20th century. The May 4th movement in its most radical form rejected Confucius, rejected the philosophies of the past. In the Cultural Revolution, half a century after that, you have the sense that the feudal relics of the past, including that philosophical tradition, were essentially there to be expunged. But from the 80s and 90s onwards, long before Xi Jinping, but embraced by Xi Jinping, China's traditional philosophy, not just Confucianism, but legalism, Xunzi, all sorts of thinkers from that era, have been rehabilitated as a powerful repertoire of thinking that does not draw from the Western tradition, but can be of significance to China today. Just one example on top of my head, there are plenty of others. Zhao Tingyang, major thinker, very influential in certain policy circles in Beijing, I believe. He has spent a lot of time thinking about pre-modern ideas of empire or space or universe, however you want to put it, not outer space, obviously, but tianxia, as a way of understanding how you can have a China in the present day that is both a constituted nation state, but also has a sort of more cross-border global influence as well. And I think that use of that kind of very explicit repertoire of pre-modern thinking at one level is conceptually incompatible with a revival of Marxism, but at the other end also points out what I think China would like to say, which is that it's not that it has one particular ideology, it's rather it likes to draw on a range of ideological strands to make sense of what's going on in the world today. And when outsiders might protest that, a sort of mixture of Confucianism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really make sense and sounds a bit sort of thrown together, I think they might point out quite reasonably that none of the broader frameworks of thinking, liberalism, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, whatever it might be, have actually proved sufficient in the Western world to understand the extraordinary changes that we've all been living through for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Fantastic. So we have lots of questions coming in on the chat. I do want to encourage everybody to raise your hands if you want. It's the best way certainly to get your question answered, because we probably won't get to everything in the chat. But let's go to Al, and great to see you, Al.
Great. Thanks very much. Could you please expound a little more on the impact that the Silicon Valley Bank crisis might have on China? And financially, I've read, and this might be incorrect, that China is actually not that efficient at deploying capital for research and technology. That they sort of do a shotgun approach, and it's very expensive. And wondering whether they're going to perhaps reposition themselves, if you could imagine, the crisis is getting a lot worse. And will that possibly force them to pull back to some degree from their position in Russia? I'm trying to tie Russia in here, but is there going to be potentially some significant fallout from this, do you think?
Thanks, Al. I'd refer you to a quote which I think is apocryphal, but my Sovietist colleagues will authenticate it or not. It was always attributed to the late Generalissimo Marshal Stalin, which was, he was talking allegedly about tank production. And when people pointed out that Soviet tanks were numerous but not very good, he replied, yes, but quantity has its own quality. And I think that there is something to be said. Did you ever say that, Cynthia? I've heard it attributed, but not necessarily authenticated. Anyway, take it as read for the moment. I mean, the point I think stands in terms of the tech sector, which is what you're talking about, Al. China, we repeatedly hear, not least from China, China files more patents than any other country in the world. Well, okay, but how many of them actually are genuine innovations that are going to be able to, be the next big thing? And yet, it is true that it's scattershot. It is true that an awful lot of capital is wasted. That's true in Silicon Valley as well, by the way. Ask any kind of startup, startup entrepreneur. All of those things, and yet Huawei, ZTE, ByteDance, Hikvision. I mean, you need to go on. I mean, again, if we're going to do the contrast between Russia and China, I have said before and will say again, if your brand name of choice in China is Huawei, and your brand name of choice in Russia is Kalashnikov, then it says something, I think, quite significant about where your economy has oriented itself and what it can do. In other words, yes, it is true that China has a tech sector that has many flaws. I would, for instance, point out the difficulty of attracting and retaining talent, because a lot of talent isn't very political in terms of, worrying too much about autocracy versus democracy. But today's China, Xi Jinping's China, does have a very strong sense that it wants political control of the tech sector. We've seen it at the kind of superstar level with Jack Ma and the fact that he's had to step back from the front line. But more than that, also the sort of wider sense at the less glamorous but important level that maybe the terms and conditions in the tech sector, working very hard, maybe the rewards are becoming less, all those sorts of things are putting some people off. So that's a real problem in terms of talent pipeline and needs to be dealt with. But I think I would be wary about claiming that that is a sort of fundamental undermining of what China's tech sector is capable of doing. I would not say, and again, I'm trying to be cautious here, there are lots of sort of apocalyptic stories about how China is ahead on absolutely everything when it comes to tech and so forth. And I think that is overly generalized. I think there are lots of sectors, many actually we all know, where the United States, where South Korea, where a variety of other countries actually have an advantage. But it would also be unwise to deny that there are a lot of areas, particularly areas that involve, for obvious reasons, the collation and processing of big data, because China is able to pick up data, particularly internally, on a much more comprehensive basis than a liberal society, because privacy laws do exist, but they exist largely to protect Chinese consumers against private companies, not against the state. And the state can gather your data, process it in a major way. And what the state would argue, and does argue very strongly, is that means that we can look at cancer detection rates, because we basically take people's medical data, we don't ask if they can have it or not, we just put it in there and look, this is what we can do in terms of wide-scale testing. It can also be used in other ways for citizen surveillance, and that's the story that generally gets out in the wider news. It's perfectly true, but what it tends to ignore is that for an awful lot of people in China, particularly because China is such a low trust society, the feeling that the processing of big data can provide assurance rather than surveillance is a more widespread feeling amongst some in the middle class than I think is sometimes realized in the liberal world.
Wow. Thanks so much. I want to ask a question in the chat from my colleague here at George Mason, Michael Chang, who's also a Chinese historian like you, and actually joined our conversation last semester and helped us to start to understand some of these issues. He writes, could Dr. Mitter share his thoughts about the prospects of the PRC renewing its economic growth, and whether this is reliant upon its foreign relations and establishing some sort of international influence, political economic dominance in the global economy? Or is the prospect of Xi's realizing economic growth and common prosperity domestically less dependent upon, if not entirely autonomous from, its power and influence internationally? And he said, finally, he would love to hear Dr. Mitter's views on the local debt crisis within the PRC and how this may or may not pose a threat to continued domestic economic growth.
Wonderful. Well, great to have Michael on here as well. And of course, as a great scholar of the Qing dynasty, I suspect that he will have all sorts of comparisons that may not occur to me as a Republican specialist. So I would love to have those comparisons there. So there's a very central issue in terms of the PRC's economic revival. And I gave at the beginning of some of the factors that I think are relevant, in some cases quite positive. But I think that there are a couple of issues that are very fundamental and haven't yet been solved, but could be, but they involve trade-offs. So number one is one we haven't mentioned at all. I haven't mentioned at all yet, so I put the blame on myself. I'll mention it now. It's rural China. Half of China's population, even if you take the more generous definition of what urban China is, half of China's population lives in the countryside. And life chances in the countryside and the basic factors that underpin economic growth are just much, much less favorable in those areas. If you look, and I'm being very, very crude in my statistics here, but you look at about a 3-to-1 ratio in terms of per capita urban wealth and per capita rural wealth in China. And one of the reasons it stays more static and more unequal than in almost any other large society of that sort is that unlike India, unlike Indonesia, unlike Nigeria, there is no free internal migration. You have to have your hukou, your residence permit, to be able to move fully and legally to somewhere else. And moving from the countryside to the city is almost never granted. It doesn't mean people can't move. So let's be clear, you know, the construction industry in China, which is now also in decline, but had been rising for a long time, that was unsustainable without the labor of 200 to 250 million migrant workers, but they moved without their full welfare rights because they didn't have hukou permission to move. And that sort of inhibition, on the one hand, means that China doesn't have slums on the outskirts of its cities in the way that large cities in many other developing economies do, but it also means that there is a sort of built-in stagnation that can't be immediately overcome. Also, the fact of those parents going out to work in the countryside means that one of the most productive parts of the labor force, as I say, is operating without full rights. That means that, for instance, to get to the practicality of this, and if anyone will be interested, by the way, you can still find online a documentary I made for BBC Radio called the New Iron Rice Bowl. It's now about 10 years old, and bizarrely enough, I think it's still valid, about how the lack of social mobility in China is inhibiting domestic consumption. It was true when we made it in 2012, and it's still true in 2023, even post-COVID. So migrant workers, you know, 200 million people, that's, you know, a third of the, or whatever, perhaps about a third of the, 2/3 of the population of the United States. Those people could unleash a domestic consumption revolution if they felt confident to spend. But if you had uncertain residence rights, you've got a kid to educate who has to pay private fees because you're not allowed to use the local schools because they're not permitted because you don't have the permit. Or the kids back in rural China where you have to pay fees for really poor schooling because none of the urban graduates wants to go and teach in the countryside. So all of these quite granular factors come together to actually create a real obstacle in the way of creating that domestic consumption revolution. You keep hearing China's economic leadership saying over and over again, we've got to unleash domestic consumption, we've got to unleash domestic consumption. But actually what you get is incredibly high rates of saving. And if you lived in a low trust society with very low welfare rights and very low predictability, I mean, Michael's a historian, he will know this very well, stuff happens in China. That's one of the reasons why we love doing its history. There's a reason, much though I love Switzerland, there's a reason that most people don't bother to become historians of Switzerland. Nothing much happens most of the time. Not quite. Apologies to any William Tell or John Calvin fans. Not always true, or indeed Max Frisch or Friedrich Dürrenmatt. But you know, basically, you can you can rest fairly easy that things will stay broadly same-ish in Switzerland. Not so much in China. So all of those factors, I think, push back strongly against the idea of domestic economic growth being driven by consumption. And really, we need to look at a significant rethinking of the economic model, the dual circulation model, which is the term that's used at the moment for what the leadership want to do, has, to use a good Marxist term, contradictions, Maldon, in it, because it simultaneously seems to advocate that simultaneously China must increase its global trade surplus, which China wants to do to, you know, make sure that it's central to global supply chains, increase domestic consumption, put more money in people's pockets to consume, and keep China's capital account closed. Now, these three things are all perfectly plausible policy goals. They're probably not all plausible policy goals at the same time. And so far, we have not had a clear picture of which, if any, of those three, the trifecta, is going to be pushed aside to make way for
Mhm.
the other two. So that was some thoughts, I think, about sort of where the kind of economic story might go, if that was what Michael was getting at.
Well, if I could just jump in with a follow-up from
Sure.
Alfredo that sort of ties into this too. He asks, will the Chinese government use this current economic crisis as an opportunity to turn towards homegrown tech, or will they also try to attract outside investment via joint ventures because those might be seen as a safer bet, safer than other tech hubs?
Sorry, just say that once more again.
Will they use this current crisis as an opportunity to turn towards homegrown tech, or will they also try to attract outside investment via joint ventures into
Oh, I see. Yeah.
into stimulating their technological sector?
Sure. I mean, there's always an interest in attracting more investment, and actually one of the fates, I think, for Hong Kong in the next future is that, as we've seen, the individual civil liberties, which it enjoyed for many years, have in many cases been removed, or at very least heavily constrained. But Hong Kong's role as a major pool of capital still continues to be very much the case, and of course the fact that it's geographically absolutely right next to Shenzhen, one of those major tech hubs, is very significant in that context. In terms of innovation, I think that we're in a period of transition. I guess we're always in a period of transition, but the particular transition at the moment is that, yes, the aim is to try and make sure that as much tech innovation is indigenous as possible. But in certain areas, it's still important for China to be connected to talent pools around the world. So a lot of people think this is about, just about artificial intelligence and quantum and cyber. But let me take a slightly less politically contentious example, because I think it shows some of the difficulties on both sides that go on. Life sciences. One of the things that China does a lot of is scientific tie-ups with universities and corporates as well in North America, in Western Europe, Australia, in areas to do with bioscience. This can be a variety of areas, but let's take, mental health. Mental health is a big issue. It's a big issue in China. It depends which statistics you use, but some people would say that 100 million Chinese are currently engaging with mental health issues one way or another. That covers a whole spectrum. But the point is, it's not trivial. One of the big moments, some of you will know this, about, I want to say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even say 15, was when one of China's best known TV talk show hosts said at the end of his show that he was taking some weeks off months off actually, maybe, because he needed to go and get treated for mental health issues that he was having, I think depressive issues. This was a huge big deal, because even in the Western world, saying this sort of thing out loud still has a certain difficulty around it. To say in China, a society where people really didn't talk about these things, that was a big thing for that host to do. But it indicated this wider penumbra that was going on of this major issue that continues to be a major factor in China today, particularly actually driven by urbanization, which globally sociologists have shown tends to increase the pressure on mental health in a whole variety of areas. Okay, so if that's all the case, then basically all these Chinese pharmaceutical companies potentially producing antidepressants and other next generation pharmaceutical products that are going to deal with those issues. Also, one other factor that links to that, I mentioned elder care. Depression and aging, in many cases, not all cases, thankfully, but in many cases do go together quite strongly. As you've got a rapidly aging population in China, you will also have more people who have mental health issues that relate to aging. And that's not just depression, that could be memory loss issues. It could, there are a whole variety of things. So all of that means that bioscience, there's a reason that life sciences are really big in China. There's also a reason that they have that very strong collaboration with a whole variety of outside actors. Now, those outside actors, big Western corporates, Western universities, I think would be in trouble if they suddenly had to cut off that scientific collaboration with China. And there aren't that many places in the world where you can do field trials with 1 million people in them. China, India, Indonesia, maybe a few others. But it also would be a big deal for China, because essentially getting that scientific collaboration, the knowledge, the techniques, the circuits of knowledge that come from that collaboration, you can't wholly reproduce those within China. In some areas, yes, but in various other things, you actually do need to be in part of that global circuit of knowledge. And that's the contradiction, that word again, that China has, whether it's an antagonistic or a non-antagonistic contradiction, we would need Chairman Mao back to tell us. But overall, the question of how far do you want to be self-sufficient in terms of a field like life sciences, so whatever you do is safely contained within your borders, and how much needs to be linked in elsewhere. Don't link to the outside world. Okay, you're great as long as you're behind the balls, but every month, month, year you go on, you're losing more and more of that connection to the circuits of knowledge in the outside world, and you're obsolete within a few years before you know it. Or you're plugged into those global circuits of knowledge, but then the spiritual pollution, the Wuran Jingshan, Jingshan Wuran, comes in and in some ways brings the malign influence, as the party sees it, of the outside world into the system, because smart people who are interested in pharmaceuticals and anything else also tend to have ideas about politics and other ideas too. So it is a contradiction that cannot easily be resolved, and I don't see any signs at the moment that it has been resolved on the Chinese side. Every bit as much as on the Western side, there is this huge debate we all know in our own societies going on about, should we be at one end of the spectrum and say scientific collaboration with China has to end tomorrow morning because it's far too dangerous, to the other end that says you just basically nixed 45% of global papers in physics, 35% in bioscience, and 95% in artificial intelligence. I made those numbers up, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Great, thank you. Why don't we go to one of my students? Augusta, I see your hands up.
Thank you so much. I am Professor Hooper's student, and I'm also a student from China. I'm an international student at College of Holy Cross. And my question to Professor Mitter is, do you think China's outlook will change in maybe some years or a few generations? Because when I think about the United States, I think it has a democratic and liberal system that has been working for quite a while. And I personally think the US kind of hasn't changed much in that sense by having a relatively stable political system. But I think it's a little different in China. I tend to think that China and maybe many other countries have a greater generational gap in that sense. I feel that my grandparents' generation have just got out of starvation and stuff, but we also have my generation of people who absorb knowledge and information from the Western world on TikTok every day. And we also have the decline of birth rate that's going on in China, like the natural birth rate. We have like a negative value since last year for the first time. And my question is, do you think because of this greater generational gap, I at least perceived it, do you think because of that, maybe the outlook or the political dynamic will change because of a new generation of people, myself included, have a different outlook or different information, or we learn about Western democracy more? Do you think that will cause the domestic situation to change maybe in a few generations?
No, Augusta, great question. And I hope you talked about your generation. I hope you're not 最后一代, the last generation, which is what a lot of young people on Chinese social media were talking about. In other words, they're going to be not going to have any kids, and they're just not going to engage with the next generation of what happens in China. But let's hope we can reverse that. I think that there is a very strong sense, actually, that there are generational differences, but also differences in terms of experience that shape the way that people think about the future. If you think about the top 10 economies in the world, of which China, of course, is currently number 2, at least by GDP, every single one of them, with a partial exception, but not that much of an exception, of India, has essentially had in some ways, predictable framework of operation since 1945. United States, Germany, Italy, UK, Canada, India, a couple of others. Because essentially all of them have been electoral democracies with a variety of milestones, signposts that say where things are going to go. So if you think about something like pensions, which I mentioned before, it is generally more reliable over time to have a pension system or a pension scheme in a predictable economy, because you're basically making a bet for decades into the future. And I would have thought that anyone investing in a pension in China in 1937 or 1949 or 1965, assuming such a thing had been possible, might have been onto a bit of a loser, unfortunately. And it's one of the reasons, actually, I think, that the perception of unpredictability has led both to a very high level of savings in China in the reform era. It's one of the reasons that people do keep money for a rainy day, but also I think in some ways invest in types of property that have a kind of, what would you call it, sort of bottom line value. I mean, China has an over 90% property ownership rate. And that is something that I think comes from the idea that whatever else happens, at least you'll have somewhere to live in an unpredictable scenario. So I think that question of being a society where people, in their 70s or 60s or 70s have memories of continuing change and unpredictability. You could have lived through the Cultural Revolution, as indeed Xi Jinping did, in your teenage years, seen the reform era, 1989, Tiananmen Square, and then back and forth, a narrowing and a widening and an opening of civil society. I think it would give you a general sense that life wouldn't be predictable. The difference, I think, possibly changing in the last few years with COVID, but the difference I think with Russia, though, is that while life in China has been very unpredictable, in the last 40 to 45 years, there's been enough signs of an overall level of growth and social mobility that it gives people some sort of narrative that they can find plausible. Unless you're sort of kind of upper middle class to super rich in Russia, I have a sense that in a more general sense, many of the aspects of the unpredictability of the most recent years, like, the 1998 financial disaster in Russia, which everyone except Russianists forgets about these days, has shaped the expectations and behaviors of a whole variety of people who in other circumstances would be those long-term investors in society and, its financial, social and human capital, to think that actually maybe this isn't a great idea because you're not going to know what happens next. And I think China, for the moment, has done a better job of being able to persuade people, broadly speaking, that they should still invest literally as well as metaphorically in the system. But the question is whether or not post-COVID that now comes bouncing back, or whether COVID was a real game changer. My sense at the moment is that I think that actually people are moving forward on that. But again, that goes right back as we come near the end, going back to the beginning. We have to see if that economic scenario that I pointed out, scenario number one, actually comes forward, because if it doesn't, then I think that the disillusionment amongst the wider population might well be more noticeable.
So we've hit 1 o'clock. I'd appreciate it if you stay just a few more minutes.
Sure.
We've
No,
got
we
a
can certainly do
lot of great
another
questions.
10, 10
for,
minutes or so. Sure.
Okay, fantastic. We'll ask maybe we'll ask for some kind of quick comments on a couple of questions here.
Sure.
Jessica asks in the chat, really interesting question.
Yes.
Says, can you speak to the relationship between China and Hungary? She says, for example, the development of Fudan University in Budapest, and how might this contribute to Hungary's positionality in the EU, where it is often referenced as a Trojan horse? How do you see this relationship affecting the war, if at all? And finally, does China have genuine interest in Hungary, or is Hungary sort of too insignificant a player for all of this?
Indeed. No, absolutely. Well, I see Jessica with a nudge there as well. So there's definitely a Hungarian connection there, I'm sure of. And actually, you mentioned, Jessica, a Trojan horse. I can raise you on that, because I don't know if you've seen the movie by the great Hungarian director Béla Tarr, the Turin horse, which is about 4 hours long and has about 5 words of dialogue, all in Hungarian, to be fair. It's all in black and white too. It's definitely, as art house experiences go, it's one of the more extended I've had. Yeah, I've appeared on a seminar a bit like this one, actually, with the Hungarian Central Bank in the recent past, with Chinese speakers there involved as well. I think we're all aware that Hungary is basically playing some quite on the edge games when it comes to where it sees its interests. It has no intention, unlike the UK, of leaving the EU, because it's having too much fun being inside the EU and grabbing all the good stuff while pushing back and saying how awful people in Brussels are being to Orban and his government. But also there is this strong sense, I think, which is perhaps more generally felt in the conservative parts of Hungarian society, that these states which have a sort of welfare authoritarianism around them. I mean, again, we should be fair and compare like with like. I mean, the governmental system in Hungary has become much more hybrid and moved away from pluralism in a way that was visible 10 years ago. But Hungary is not China and it's not Russia, and one shouldn't equate the two in that sense. But I do think that they find areas to talk about. I think the idea overall of collective social values, the idea that you use the power of the state to reward those who share your worldview and punish those who don't, that's something in different sorts of ways that Hungarian conservatives and Chinese communists, rather bizarrely, who are actually quite conservative in various ways, both find an area of common discussion. I think that China, in practical terms, does find it easier to talk to Budapest about a variety of things to do with, for instance, investment in Eastern Europe, and probably does see Hungary as a good gateway point to have those conversations more broadly with the eastern part of the continent, less than in the past, because I think a variety of other actors in that space, Lithuania would be a good example, have found themselves on the rough end of Chinese diplomacy. That has not gone so well in many cases, and I think that has peeled off many of the countries in Eastern Europe that had been interested in Chinese investment, but wonder now about the political costs. But I would say that China's interests in Hungary, they're probably relatively limited these days, but there is a sort of historical sense of connection, because you have to remember that back in 1956, of course, the Western world had a particular view of the uprising and it's being crushed, but it's often forgotten that actually Mao was rather sympathetic to the insurgency and rather mourned its crushing, not because he had any sympathy with liberal protesters, but because, of course, it was his old enemy, Khrushchev, who was by that stage in power, and who clearly Mao regarded as a much, much worse danger to the socialist world than clearly these people rising up against him in Hungary. So Hungary has played a slightly odd role in terms of China's perception of itself as a socialist actor in the more distant past. And some of that, perhaps not too much, but some of that perhaps remains as a point of interest in the viewpoints of China today.
Just very quickly, another student of mine named Sky asked in the chat about, I think, yesterday's summit between South Korea and Japan, and efforts to come to agreement there about forced labor and World War II era atrocities, and what you see as as the relationship between these diplomatic efforts and China's growing power in the region. Do you see a connection?
So connection between?
Well, between Japan and South Korea's
Japan
efforts
and South Korea. Oh, I see. Yeah.
To come together.
Yeah.
Is that, does that have anything to do with their concern about China's growing power?
No, I think that's fine. Okay. Yes, I think the answer is certainly yes in the most literal sense. I mean, Japan has just essentially argued it's going to double its defense budget in the next 5 years. South Korea, obviously, I mean, at the moment, I think South Korea is once again more distracted by the North, which has fired yet another set of missiles off the coast of Japan. So there is a whole variety of activity in the region that is causing people to assess their various actions. But overall, I think it is fair to say that the central contradiction in the region is becoming more stark between a security environment where the United States still has a powerful, if no longer as dominant a role, its alliances with Japan, South Korea, agreements which are not quite at the full level of alliance, but nonetheless important partnerships with places like the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, in fact, as well. But in other words, a sort of security environment where an AUKUS recently signed, the Quad, all of these structures, they sit in contrast to the fact that China is now unarguably the largest economic partner for pretty much every actor in the Asia-Pacific region. That includes Japan and South Korea as well. And the question of how these things come together is still unresolved. You know, there's huge amounts of South Korean and Japanese investment in mainland China. Samsung are there, Toyota are there, Nissan are there, LG are there. I don't see any signs particularly that they're looking to get out either. And where they would find either as large a market for their finished goods or that level of skill and relative cost efficiency in terms of the kind of middle stages of production of their products is very unclear. You know, China is no longer the place to go, hasn't been for some time, in terms of dirt cheap construction. So, you know, cheap shoes or plastic toys or whatever, that's gone to Cambodia, Vietnam, Vietnam's much, but Cambodia, and a variety of other economies which have the need for more basic labor. But China is still very, very dominant in a whole variety of areas of sort of middle level construction of technology that demands a certain amount of skill. It can't just sort of be banged together, but which isn't the highest level of added value. So all of those things are of value, or they're known, and they are valuable to the South Koreans and the Japanese, and how they balance those issues with the increasingly strong sense, particularly in Japan, that they want to ramp up security concerns against China has yet to be resolved. I think so. Yes, the agreement is important, but it doesn't solve the economic problems in a way that it tries to address the security and military problems.
So let me ask you one last question, and it's a big one, and I know you only have a couple of minutes, so you're going to have to give us a quick thought. Jeffrey
Sure.
Milstein, one of our longtime listeners, says, to what extent does the PRC government use and believe historical and legal claims to Taiwan, and how does this compare to Putin's claims to Ukrainian territory? And I know it's way too much to answer really quickly, but I'm just curious, a couple of thoughts from you.
Well, actually, I could probably give a brief thought in terms of what might happen if there were greater confrontation. As I've said, my first scenario suggests that there is a perfectly plausible pathway in which there is not a confrontation. I think that's what we should all hope for. Okay, China will claim, and lots of actors, including in the global south, I think will frankly go with them on this, that the two cases are not cognate, because Ukraine is an internationally recognized state that has internationally recognized borders at the United Nations, and those borders have been violated. China's, Wang Yi, China's foreign affairs counselor, has said, we recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. That's pretty straightforward. What they're going to do about it is another matter, but it has been stated. Taiwan is not recognized as a country by the United States, by European actors, by only a very, very small number of other countries. And in the end, the argument, the dispute about Taiwan is going to be about its autonomy, possibly its democracy, not about its sovereignty. And China, I think, will push that point hard. It does push that point already. It does not recognize that there is any conversation to be had about the question of Taiwan's separation in that sense. And the questions that come up, therefore, for those who want to essentially try and get that very, very fragile sense of a balance of the status quo, is how that can actually be done in a way that provides something that Beijing insists that it still wants to have, which is the possibility of unification in some recognizable timetable, but the increasing reality and realization that Taiwan has a security importance for the whole of the Western Pacific, including for countries like Japan, and also that its domestic political system, which is an extremely functional liberal democracy, needs to be preserved and protected in a way that isn't at the moment clearly indicated through any means of international negotiation. So I think that those quite granular issues are just quite different from Ukraine's issues, and a question of whether or not there can be serious engagement between the United States, China, Japan, and all the other key actors who have an interest in Taiwan in different ways is yet to be seen.
Rana, thank you so much. These questions around China, I think, just continue to fascinate us. It's kind of the first country we've returned to have a second conversation, because I think it's so important, everything that's going on here. And your insight was just fantastic. Everybody keep an eye out for Dr. Mitter on the BBC. You'll see him there frequently. Cynthia, I'll let you close us out. Oh, Cynthia, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry about that. I didn't have anything else to say except
Okay.
huge thanks to our guest, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week at back at our usual time of 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks for being here.
Have a great week,
Thanks so much
everybody.
to everyone. Really good to see you. Bye.
Bye.